The very last thing that anyone wants is to be truly different. No one wants to be the odd one out that gets stares in the streets or whispers behind their back. And this is no more true than for younglings. Younglings are historically cruel, and it's also historically cruel that I have to say that word instead of what they actually are, otherwise this channel will be nuked, but only because they are brutally honest. They have yet to master the adult art of telling a white lie and not commenting on something if it might offend someone else. If there's a flaw in your appearance, you better believe that a youngling will point it out to you at full volume with a smile on their face. And younglings are very quick to notice when there's a difference between themselves and others. When something is not the same, some of these things can be subtle, even hard to notice, and some of them can be blindingly obvious. So how do you think the local people, and indeed the offspring that they had, may have reacted if two strange youngsters appeared amongst them without any warning, and their skin was completely green? Let's head over to jolly old England, and no, that's not a threat, that's actually where we're going, and turn back the clock over 800 years to see how this apparently played out. Woolpit is a village in East Anglia, England. If there is anyone that is interested in this specific geography of England at the time, it was located in what is now the country of Suffolk, which is located to the southeast of the country. In the 12th century, when this event occurred, what is known now as England was in a state of uproar and turmoil. Well, I guess it was really the same thing as it is now, the entire world is. Thanks for watching. While the exact date has not survived the intervening centuries, this appearance has been either quoted as happening in the year 1150 or just have been during the reign of King Stephen, who ruled from 1135 to 1154. There was widespread anarchy, civil war, and just a general sense of chaos and commotion that blighted this relatively short reign. In fact, portions of it are simply remembered now as the anarchy. Woolpit itself was named after wolf pits, which were located around the township. Wolf pits were deep traps dug into the ground that locals would use to try to capture local wolves, which were widespread around that part of England at the time, and stop the havoc that they wreaked on the local livestock. These pits were normally dug near farms in order to stop wolves from getting to other animals, and would be covered across the top with branches and leaves to disguise them. Once bait was placed in the pit, the wolves would be attracted to the smell and then fall inside the pit itself. Once they were inside, due to the construction of the pit, they would simply find it impossible to extract themselves and would remain trapped there until the locals came to check on the traps and put them out of their misery. Two pre-adults appeared in this small and relatively remote village, and there were a number of things about them that seemed odd. They were found near one of the wolf pits. Some sources claim they physically climbed out of one, and according to accounts that survived from the time, they spoke a language that none of the locals could understand. William of Newborough recounted the discovery as such in his History of English Affairs, written in 1220. During harvest, while the reapers were employed in gathering in the produce of fields, two pre-adults, a boy and a girl, completely green in their persons and clad in garments of a strange color and unknown materials, emerged from these wolf pits. Their clothes that they wore were not what was typical for the area or the locale, and probably more concerning than any of the other details, they had a strange color to them. Their skin appeared to be green. The pair were taken and brought under the care of a local man who documented their story. This man, Ralph de Calne, or Calne, I'm sure somebody will tell me how to pronounce that in the comments, is where we get the second main source for this information from. A local, educated man who took the children under his care and recorded his accounts of the matter. Neither of the two would eat for the first few days that they were there. In fact, they refused all food initially until they found some beans that they happily ate entirely raw. These beans were either given to them or they found them raw in Ralph's garden and ate them straight from the ground. And this whole thing is rather interesting considering the lore of changelings existed, which was basically these monsters would change out offspring of people and then they never quite grew correctly, or they had some like weird kind of like foresight or ability to speak beyond their years. It was very interesting, but really probably changelings and their lore just come from the fact that things were tough back then, and having an extra mouth to feed, if the pre-adult was not turning out correctly or there was something off about them, which they wouldn't know what that was back then, they would probably just unfortunately do away with people. Anyhow, the reports of both the man that they stayed with, Ralph de Calne, and the other sources from the time of William Newborough seem to agree that they began to adopt a more normal diet over time. They managed to successfully wean themselves off the very odd and restricted diet and ate much like the locals. Also, the green color of their skin seemed to slowly fade as time went on. Around this time, despite the fact that they were getting more accustomed to their surroundings and losing their sickly green color, The boy became sickly himself. Suffering from an unknown illness, he progressively got worse and worse before succumbing to the mystery illness, leaving only his sister. Which, to be honest with you, wasn't really that strange at the time, because there were tons of illnesses that we just simply didn't know what caused them, and it was bad for everybody. But while there was initially a language barrier, the girl was taught to speak English and managed to communicate some facts about where they had come from. She claimed that the place where her brother and her had come from was known as St. Martin, or St. Martin's Land, a place named that no one had ever heard of or was aware of. Her descriptions of the place shed no further light on it. She claimed that the sun rarely shone where they were, and from when it did, it was simply like a constant twilight. When it came to how exactly they appeared at the wolf pits, she had the following explanation to offer. On a certain day when we were feeding our father's flocks in the field, say that 5 times fast, we heard a great sound, such as we are now accustomed to hear in St. Edmunds. When the bells are chiming, and whilst listening to the sound in admiration, we became on a sudden, as it were, entranced, and found ourselves amongst you in the fields where you were reaping. So according to the girl, who would go on to take the name Agnes Barr and serve in the house of Ralph de Calne for many years, she and her brother weren't even sure how they had gotten there. They were simply tending to their father's livestock when the head of the bells chime, and with no further explanation, appeared by the side of the wolf pits. At the time, they were unaware what the sound of the bells tolling even were, but once she had lived under Ralph's roof, she recognized them as the local bells at a nearby St. Edmunds. It was a strange tale that did little to explain either where they had come from or how they even were there in the first place, far less why they spoke a completely different language and were dressed in entirely separate clothes than what could be expected around the area. And least of all, it shed no light whatsoever on why they were both green, or indeed why the color had actually faded over time. If anything, the explanation of Agnes and what she gave raised more questions than it answered. Many aspects of the explanation were conflicting, or at least survive in conflicting forms. Some mentioned entering a cave from their own land, which is how they ended up at the wolf pit. This particular aspect led to some going down their route to their own people somehow existing in a largely subterranean manner. People latched onto her description of the lack of light in her homeland and expanded from there to a point where the children's entire home life existed underground. According to the surviving sources of Ralph de Calne and William of Newborough, Agnes would go on to live a full life. She stayed with Ralph for many years, although her conduct was described as being loose and wanton. She was married to a man from town 40 miles away, and little else is known of her life beyond that. Some sources name the man as Richard Barr, an archdeacon in Ely, and suggest that they had at least one child. But given how long ago this allegedly occurred, the fact that we even have 2 separate and even slightly plausible sources for such a strange tale is a miracle in and of itself. The real mystery surrounding these 2 younglings is the strange tone of their skin. I mean, obviously that's the biggest thing. What caused it, what cured it, and how it plays into their wild story of their unknown homeland. Honestly, they're probably just Dutch. There are some explanations in the modern era that could possibly explain why someone may turn green, or at least have their skin take on a greenish hue. It is possible that the offspring were simply extremely malnourished, and that their general poor health led to a tinge in their skin. Proponents of this theory point out that they became more adapted to a normal diet and began to be properly fed, so the color slowly faded from them. This medical term from this was actually called hypochromic anemia, or chlorosis, where an extremely poor diet led to the deterioration of the blood, causing the skin to appear to change color. Given that once the pair had been weaned off just eating raw beans and acquired a taste for bread and more normal fare, the color disappeared. This would seem to explain their coloration and the way it returned fairly accurately. It has also been pointed out, however, that this form of coloration due to malnutrition or partial starvation or illness would not have been that remarkable to the people at that time. Hunger, famine, and general poor health were fairly common everywhere around this time. Some look to this as a point that would prove these offspring were either exceptionally green or green in a way unlike anyone had ever seen before. Another theory is that they were deliberately poisoned by someone and left by the wolf pit to basically meet their end. However, it begs the question as to why someone would do it, and why they would only partially poison them and then abandon them, or even how they were able to survive. If someone had planned on taking out these 2 by poisoning or otherwise, why would they leave them somewhere where they were likely to be discovered by others? And why did neither of them mention anything even slightly related to this once they had recovered and the girl at least learned English? The lack of spoken English is also another strange aspect to this mystery that seems to make it a little more difficult to kind of rationalize what's happening. Some put it down as to the girls' rather bizarre description of the place where they were from. In some interpretations, it sounded like a land similar to England in many ways, but then in others, extremely different. More rational commenters have looked at the sources and suggested that the pair were perhaps Flemish orphans, having lost their parents either through the ongoing anarchy all around them or becoming separate from them in their own group. It would explain why they couldn't understand the people around them and the locals could not understand them. The Flemish were being particularly persecuted at this time, and it sounds very possible that this might explain their lack of English. However, some have pointed to the fact that Ralph de Calne, the man who took them in and raised Agnes after her brother met his end, would have been an educated man, a man who would have clearly been able to read and write, and given his surviving account, some question whether a man of his education and expertise would really not have been able to understand Flemish to a certain degree, or at least be able to identify it as a language being spoken. Flemish, while not overly common in England at the time, is essentially a form of Dutch, and commenters have mentioned that it shouldn't have been so vanishingly rare that Ralph himself, or even a single local, would not have been able to at least get an idea of what the language was. As always, there were more way far-fetched theories and explanations that seem to crop up around every single difficult-to-explain event. Sources as far back as 1621 seem to put forward the theory that the green pair fell from heaven. While this book by Robert Burton doesn't expand much further on what he meant by this, many have taken it to imply that they were some form of extraterrestrial and beings from another planet. After all, the lack of spoken English, the green skin, has long been a favorite archetype of alien creatures. In more recent times, an astronomer named Duncan Lunan presented his own otherworldly explanation. He believes that they may have been accidentally transported to where they were found from their home planet in space. He believes their home planet is trapped in orbit and that somehow these specific conditions combined to deposit these unfortunate offspring somewhere outside of Suffolk more than 800 years ago, which is the most unfortunate of fates. The exact mechanism of how any of this was supposed to have taken place was never quite fully explained by Duncan. So before we get too invested in trying to separate out all the various threads, leads, and unfinished rabbit holes, it is worth asking the most basic of all questions. Did this even really happen? And if it did, how trustworthy are the sources and references that have survived over the years? How likely is it that we have true, untainted, and accurate information from something that happened so many centuries ago? While Ralph de Calne's information is presumed to be firsthand, William Newborough recorded his retelling of the story a number of years after the fact. While he reported it as being truthful as far as he was able, he did include an odd disclaimer where he essentially said it was up to the reader to choose what they believed. Very good. That's what you want to put when you're trying to tell people something that only really you have an account of, except for like one other guy who is most definitely gone. But there are many aspects to this story that seem to like marry up a little too closely to other ideas, themes and situations and folklore, both from the time and location as well as beyond. The part of the explanation where the offspring allegedly entered a cave in their own homeland and emerged near the wolf pits is something that has appeared elsewhere in folklore and tales. Other scholars and historians have viewed it as nothing more than a tale that grew in the retelling, something that may have started off as a fable or a legend centered around the harvest time that was passed down over the years. Even the fact that the only food the pair would apparently eat when they were first rescued being beans has been viewed through a bit of a skeptical lens. I mean, magic beans, like come on. Historically, beans were associated with both death and the afterlife, and this was a tale of these two strange pre-adults appearing at harvest time, eating only beans, and this is supposed to serve as a clumsy allegory of some sort, or at least it appears. Some have latched on to the choice of St. Martin in the place name that the Green siblings had come from. Some say St. Martin was tied closely to the underworld, and this proves the story was nothing more than a fable. Others disagree and claim that St. Martin had no such association. In short, if you look at any single aspect of this story, no matter how trivial or seemingly innocuous, there will be one person telling you that it is key and significant and proves the validity of the story, and an equal number of people telling you it means the exact opposite and proves the grand sum of absolutely nothing. The veracity of the sources, how much the information has changed over the passing years, and which parts of it are accurate or to be trusted can be argued and twisted to fit almost any explanation of these two green offspring that an individual wants to hold. I mean, it's been 800 years, And humans love adding things to stories. It's just kind of what we do. It's what we're built upon. So where does that leave us with the green offspring of Woolwich? Well, it seems that even their very existence is something that can't really be guaranteed. The reality is that any number of the interpretations, either from the time when it happened or all the way through to modern times, can be plausible if you pick and choose what you want to believe. If you think the pair were truly extraterrestrial, dropped here from heaven somehow, or if you believe that they were accidentally transported from their home planet via a rather convoluted set of circumstances involving their planet being locked in an orbit with their home sun where only a minuscule fraction of available space was viable for life, then you can by all means believe that. Also, you have to remember, the storms would be absolutely atrocious right there. I mean, they wouldn't be as bad on the Twilight, but it would still be pretty bad. And also, as the thing actually orbits the sun, I mean, I guess the planet could be turning along with the sun, sort of like what our moon does with our planet, but I don't really think that would work that well. Anyways, to support this claim, you just need to believe the sources from the time that are generally truthful and to be trusted. The only thing they got wrong was the mechanism by which the siblings managed to appear besides the wolf pits that fateful day. What if you look at everything we discussed and feel like it's more of a case of some work of fiction that has taken on a life of its own over the years? That works as well. You just need to focus on a rather common element the story shares with folklore from the time that traditional stories were being passed around the area. The contemporary sources are references, and they're well-meaning if misguided scribblings have mixed up what was supposed to be like an allegory or portrayed as fact. These things do happen. The reason is the story has stayed on the public mind and in written record or written word until this point is purely because of these classical elements and nothing more than that. Or even a third option. You can believe most of what has been recorded to be generally true, or at least recorded in good faith. These two pre-adults were in fact found that day, somewhat green in color and unable to understand the locals around them. Strangely, it could be argued that this was not the most rational take. It is the one that is supported the most by the surviving facts. While unlikely, it is entirely possible that no one understood the exact dialect of Flemish or Dutch that the offspring spoke. There were plenty of immigrants who had suffered some brutal fates around this time, and there is every chance that these pre-adults could have been left all alone and orphaned, far away from anyone that can understand them. Modern science can explain why malnutrition and illness might make someone's skin appear to turn green, but it would be unfair to pretend that those at the time would have been entirely unfamiliar with this condition. Malnutrition, starvation, and illness were commonplace around this time, and it is likely that many had witnessed firsthand the off color that came from not properly eating. If we're going to go with this more rational route, then what of the land of St. Martin? Why would the entrance through a cave happen and appear by the pit following the bells? What about the young woman's description of a land similar to England and somehow wasn't quite England? A number of these things tend to get overlooked when we start to dig into these questions. The first and possibly the most obvious is that the girl was undoubtedly traumatized. Even if we were to not believe that she appeared through a magic cave from a different land, something had clearly gone drastically wrong, and she and her brother were found by strangers pretty much on the brink of death. Whatever form it took, there is simply no way that she ended up in the place and position she was without some extreme hardship or tragedy. No one ever came to claim the children, showing that their parents of their family were most likely dead. She learned English only after being taught by her host and other locals, so how trustworthy is her account of life before that likely to be? And to top it all off, in an unfamiliar land, already having suffered through untold trauma, she loses her brother to an unknown illness. Is it any wonder that Agnes, as she became known, told a backstory that was a little larger than life? One that spoke of magic and miracles and places beyond our imagination. How much of it she misremembered, how much she embellished, and how much she simply made up is impossible to know. In all actuality, the fact that this pair appeared in or around the area where it is reported seems more likely to be true than not. The fact that they were both unable to converse with the locals also sounds plausible, if we make some assumptions about the background and history of these two pre-adults. The colors of their skin, especially given the fact that they seemed to remedy once they actually ate real food and then looked a little better, goes from being bizarre artifact of these are definitely aliens to just kind of like, oh, well, maybe they just needed to eat. But as always, it's up to you to make your own decisions. If you want to believe that it is nothing more than a fairy tale that someone bled into legitimate sources, the information is there to justify that decision. If you think that there were a pair of unfortunate immigrant orphans and somehow through like a final scrap of good fortune, Agnes managed to carve out a life for herself after it all, some of the facts bear that out as well. And if you believe they were alien creatures that accidentally made their way onto a wolf pit of Suffolk sometime in the 12th century, then the reality is that some of the facts would also support your belief there. The only thing known with any absolute certainty is that it was aliens. Now, the only thing known with any absolute certainty is that it was unusual enough and happened so many centuries ago that we were still unable to really know what happened. We're still considering it and looking into it in the modern day, in our modern world. And that alone is something worth mentioning. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be fantastic of you as it gets the video out there. Subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post. This kind of channel is just kind of like, it's trudging along. It's doing its thing. I hope you guys are enjoying these episodes. If you are and you want to hear something specifically, just let me know down in the comments. But I would like to thank my patrons real quick. Before I do that, I have merch. I believe it's roanokemerch.com if you want to check it out. Sweet. If not, don't worry about it. But back to patrons. I want to thank them real quick. At the Literal Wendigo tier, we have Grayson West. Thank you, sir. Then at the Eyewitness to the Event, we have Beaver Malaga and Mushroom Dance. And at the first-hand accounts tier, we have Cody Cherry Drake. And at the second-hand accounts, we have Kanan Johnson, Fred Rush, Justice Davis, and Troy. And to the rest of my patrons, I appreciate your guys' support. You guys are awesome. Thank you for doing that. It really keeps this channel going, and you guys are ballers. But that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one.